The storm comes out of nowhere. March 31st, 1944. 2,000 feet above the Black Pacific, Admiral Mineichi Koga grips the armrest of his seat as lightning splits the darkness around his Kawanishi flying boat. Rain hammers against the aircraft's hull like machine gun fire. Through the small porthole, he can see nothing but churning ocean and jagged clouds illuminated by brief, violent flashes. But Koga isn't thinking about the storm. In his leather briefcase beside him lies a document that represents Japan's last desperate gamble, the Z Plan. Every page meticulously detailed, every strategic calculation verified by the finest naval minds in the empire. It's a plan so brilliant, so thoroughly considered, that American defeat seems inevitable. The Americans will come from the east just as they always have. They'll throw themselves against Japan's fortress islands, Yaluit, Mila, Wei, Maloap. Those impregnable coral bastions, bristling with guns and defended by thousands of determined soldiers. And when they do, when they bleed themselves white against Japan's prepared positions, the combined fleet will emerge from Truk like an avenging sword, destroying what remains of the U.S. Pacific Fleet in one decisive battle. It's exactly what any rational military commander would do. Attack the obvious targets, fight where the enemy expects you to fight. Koga adjusts his admiral's cap and stares into the storm. At 59, he carries the weight of an empire on his shoulders, the weight of following Yamamoto, the legendary architect of Pearl Harbor, who had the fortune to die before tasting defeat. Now it falls to Koga to salvage victory from an increasingly desperate situation. "Admiral," his aide whispers over the engine noise, "the pilot says we may need to divert." "No diversions," Koga cuts him off. His voice carries the authority of a man who has spent his entire life preparing for this moment. "We proceed to Davao as planned. The fleet is waiting." What Koga doesn't know, what he cannot know as his aircraft fights through the storm toward what will become his watery grave, is that 600 miles away, American code reekers are reading his most secret communications. Philippine guerrillas have already recovered the Z plan from a crashed aircraft, and U.S. intelligence officers are studying every detail of Japan's perfect strategy. But even more shocking than this intelligence coup is what the Americans are actually planning to do with it. They're going to ignore it completely. You see, while Admiral Koga sits in his doomed aircraft, confident that he understands exactly how the Americans think, how they fight, how they must inevitably attack his fortress perimeter, the U.S. Pacific Fleet is preparing to do something that will shatter not just Japanese defenses, but the entire Japanese understanding of modern warfare. The Americans are about to prove that the most devastating weapon in war isn't superior firepower or better fortifications. It's the ability to make your enemy's entire strategic framework completely irrelevant. But how could the most brilliant naval minds in Japan be so catastrophically wrong about American intentions? To understand the magnitude of what's about to unfold, you have to step into the shoes of Rear Admiral Monzo Akiyama as he stands on the wooden dock at Kwajalein at January 15, 1944. The morning sun reflects off the lagoon's crystal-clear water, and in the distance he can see the concrete bunkers and gun emplacements that represent months of backbreaking construction work. Akiyama commands the 6th Base Force, the nerve center of Japanese operations in the Marshall Islands. From his headquarters on Kwajalein, he coordinates the defense of an island chain that stretches across hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean. It's a responsibility that weighs heavily on him, especially now that everyone knows the Americans are coming. But Akiyama isn't worried about Kwajalein. Why would he be? Look at the strategic situation through Japanese eyes in early 1944. The Americans have been following a predictable pattern since Guadalcanal.
They attack the obvious targets, the outlying positions, grinding forward step by bloody step. They took Tarawa with massive casualties. They'll do the same thing here in the Marshalls, throwing themselves against the heavily fortified outer islands where Japan is strongest. The American mind is methodical, Akiyama tells his staff officers during their morning briefing. They will attack Yaluit or Mila first. Perhaps what? They lack the imagination for anything else. His confidence isn't arrogance. It's based on solid intelligence and decades of military experience. The outer Marshall Islands bristle with defensive positions. Yaluit alone has over 3,500 troops and massive coastal guns. Malawap boasts 2,530 soldiers and some of the finest fortifications in the Pacific. These islands form an impenetrable barrier that any rational enemy must neutralize before advancing deeper into Japanese-held territory. That's how warfare works. That's how it has always worked. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles away at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz stares at aerial reconnaissance photographs spread across his conference table. His intelligence officers have just delivered a briefing that would seem impossible to Japanese strategists. They're going to bypass every major fortress island and strike directly at the heart of the Marshall Island chain. "Gentlemen," Nimitz says, his finger tracing a line across the map that skips over Jaluit, Mila, and we entirely. "We're going straight to Kwajalein."
The silence in the room is deafening. Even American officers find the plan audacious beyond belief. Kwajalein isn't just behind Japanese lines, it's the administrative center of the entire Marshall Island defense network. It's like attacking the enemy's brain while leaving his fists untouched. But that's exactly the point. American intelligence has discovered something the Japanese don't expect them to know. Kwajalein is actually the weakest link in the chain. While the outer islands are fortified to the teeth, Kwajalein has only about 1,200 combat-effective troops. The rest of its 5,000-man garrison consists of Korean laborers, construction workers, and support personnel who have never held a rifle in anger. Back on Kwajalein, Akiyama faces problems he doesn't even fully understand yet. His recent diary entries, recovered after the battle, reveal a man increasingly anxious about American reconnaissance flights that don't seem to follow any logical pattern. The enemy aircraft photograph areas that make no strategic sense, he writes on January 20th. Why do they repeatedly overfly our lagoon approaches when our main defenses face the ocean? Their intelligence must be faulty. But Akiyama's confusion runs deeper than tactical puzzlement. Like every Japanese officer, he's been trained in a military tradition that emphasizes decisive battle, honor in direct confrontation, and the spiritual superiority that comes from accepting the strongest enemy challenge. The idea that an enemy might simply avoid your strengths doesn't compute. It's not just unfamiliar, it's almost insulting. Consider the Japanese mindset in early 1944. This is a military culture that produced the samurai, that revered death before dishonor, that sees strategic retreat as cowardice. When Admiral Koga designed the Z-Plan, he wasn't just creating a military strategy, he was expressing fundamental Japanese beliefs about how honorable warriors should conduct themselves. You meet your enemy's strength against strength. You fight where the fighting is hardest. You prove your superiority through superior courage, superior discipline, superior willingness to die for your cause. The Americans, the Japanese believe, will have to fight this way too, because that's how real war is conducted. But what if the Americans don't share these beliefs? What if they see war not as a test of spiritual strength, but as a problem to be solved as efficiently as possible? What if they're willing to win ugly, to bypass honor for effectiveness, to let enemy fortresses wither on the vine while striking where the enemy is weakest? On January 29, 1944, American carrier aircraft begin the preliminary bombardment of Japanese positions throughout the Marshall Islands. But instead of concentrating on the outer fortress islands as expected, they hit targets scattered across the entire chain. Akiyama watches from his command bunker as explosions bloom across distant atolls. "They're softening up everything," his communications officer reports. "Jaluit, Miloape, Majuro, and, sir, they're hitting us here too." Akiyama nods grimly. Finally, the Americans are showing their hand. This widespread bombing campaign confirms Japanese expectations. The Americans are preparing for systematic assault on multiple fortress positions. It will be costly for them, but at least it makes strategic sense. What Akiyama doesn't realize is that he's watching the most sophisticated deception operation in naval history. The Americans aren't softening up targets for invasion. They're hiding their true intentions behind a smokescreen of universal destruction. The real blow is coming tomorrow, and when it falls, it will change everything. January 31st, 1944, 5:47 a.m. The first explosions shatter the pre-dawn silence over Kwajalein like the end of the world. Admiral Akiyama bolts upright in his bunk as his entire command bunker shakes. Concrete dust rains from the ceiling. Outside, the thunder of naval gunfire rolls across the lagoon in continuous, devastating waves. Through the narrow observation slit in his bunker wall, he can see muzzle flashes lighting up the horizon like deadly stars. But something's wrong with this picture. Terribly, impossibly wrong. "Sir," his aide bursts through the bunker door, helmet askew, eyes wide with shock. "The American fleet, they're not where they're supposed to be." Akiyama grabs his binoculars and rushes to the observation post. What he sees through the magnified lenses defies everything he thought he knew about warfare, about Americans, about the fundamental nature of military strategy itself. The U.S. Pacific Fleet isn't attacking Jaluit. It isn't pounding the massive fortifications at Miloape or Waje. Instead, 8 American battleships are sitting in the Kwajalein Lagoon inside his defensive perimeter, methodically destroying everything in sight with the precision of industrial machinery.
"How did they get past our outer defenses?" Akiyama whispers, his voice barely audible over the bombardment. The answer is as simple as it is revolutionary. They didn't go past the outer defenses, they went around them. While Japanese commanders spent months preparing for frontal assaults on their fortress islands, the Americans developed something entirely new, a strategy so audacious that it didn't even exist in Japanese military thinking. They called it island hopping. But that bland term completely fails to capture the psychological devastation it's about to unleash. The USS New Mexico opens fire with her 14-inch guns, each shell weighing as much as a small automobile. The first salvo brackets the main command bunker. The second finds its range. Akiyama watches in horrified fascination as his carefully constructed defensive positions simply cease to exist under the methodical American bombardment. But the naval gunfire is just the opening act. At 6:15 a.m., the sky fills with the drone of aircraft engines. Not the handful of planes that might support a traditional amphibious assault, but wave after wave of carrier aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo planes, fighters. More aircraft than Akiyama has ever seen in his life. Lieutenant Commander Toshio Nabata, stationed at the airfield, records in his diary what happens next. The enemy planes came out of the sun like a plague of locusts. Our fighters tried to respond, but they were outnumbered 20-1. I watched zero after zero fall, burning into the lagoon until there were no more zeros left to fall. By 7 a.m., 92 of the 110 Japanese aircraft in the Marshall Islands have been destroyed. The remainder flee to distant bases, leaving the island garrisons completely defenseless against air attack. This is the moment when Japanese strategic thinking doesn't just fail, it shatters completely. You have to understand, every Japanese plan for defending the Marshall Islands was based on the assumption that Americans would fight like Japanese. They would attack the strongest points first, seeking decisive battle, accepting massive casualties for the honor of direct confrontation.
The outer fortress islands were supposed to attract American attention, to draw them into the grinding, attritional warfare where Japanese spiritual superiority could triumph over American material advantages. Instead, the Americans treated Japanese fortress islands like obstacles to be avoided rather than challenges to be met. They left 11,000 Japanese troops on the outer islands to wither on the vine, starving, cut off from supplies, militarily irrelevant, while striking at the one point where Japanese defenses were thinnest. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders is immediate and devastating. Colonel Tarukichi Aso, commanding the 729 men of the Watch Detachment, who had just arrived on Kwajalein for transfer, stares at the American fleet through his field glasses. "This is not warfare," he mutters to his aide. "This is something else entirely." What Aso is witnessing is the birth of modern asymmetric warfare. The idea that victory comes not from defeating the enemy's strength, but from making his strength irrelevant. At 9:30 a.m., the first American landing craft hit the beaches. Major General Charles Corlett's 7th Infantry Division doesn't charge into withering defensive fire like the Marines did at Tarawa. Instead, they wade ashore on beaches that have been so thoroughly pulverized by naval gunfire that one British observer later wrote, "Nothing could have lived through that sea and air bombardment." The beach was a mass of highly colored fish that had been thrown up there by nearby explosions. The prepared Japanese defenses, the gun positions, the concrete bunkers, the carefully sited machine gun nests have been reduced to rubble and smoking craters. Most of the Korean laborers and support personnel surrender immediately, having never expected to fight a battle at all. But it's not just the physical destruction that breaks Japanese resistance. It's the complete psychological disorientation of fighting an enemy who refuses to follow the rules. Akiyama retreats to his final command bunker, trying desperately to coordinate a defense against an attack that shouldn't be happening. His radio crackles with confused reports from his surviving units. "Sir, the Americans have landed at 3 different points simultaneously. They're using some kind of amphibious tanks. We've never seen anything like them. Our coastal guns can't depress low enough to hit their landing craft in the lagoon." Every defensive plan, every carefully prepared position, every tactical doctrine developed over decades of military training has become useless overnight. The Americans aren't just winning, they're winning so easily that Japanese resistance collapses into bewildered chaos. By noon, American forces have advanced halfway across Kwajalein Island. By evening, organized Japanese resistance has effectively ended. In less than 18 hours, the administrative center of Japanese power in the Marshall Islands has fallen to an enemy attack that Japanese strategic doctrine insisted was impossible. The numbers tell their own devastating story. Out of 5,000 Japanese on Kwajalein, only 265 survive as prisoners. American casualties number just 177 killed and 1,000 wounded. It's not a battle, it's a systematic demolition carried out with industrial efficiency. But perhaps the most shocking moment comes when Akiyama, wounded and trapped in his final bunker, realizes that the Americans aren't even planning to attack the fortress islands at all. Radio intercepts reveal that Jaluit, Mila, and Vocha, the supposedly critical defensive positions that absorbed so much Japanese effort and resources, are simply being bypassed. 11,000 Japanese soldiers will spend the rest of the war sitting on heavily fortified islands that no longer matter to anyone. As American soldiers finally breach his command bunker, Akiyama experiences something no Japanese officer had ever been trained to process: the complete irrelevance of everything he thought he knew about warfare. The Americans hadn't just defeated Japanese defenses, they had made Japanese defenses meaningless. Standing in the smoking ruins of his command post, surrounded by American soldiers who look more like factory workers than samurai warriors, Akiyama understands with crystal clarity that this is not just a tactical defeat, it's the end of an entire way of thinking about war, honor, and the nature of military conflict itself.
The age of fortress warfare, of meeting strength with strength, of proving superiority through direct confrontation, dies with him in that bunker in Kwajalein Atoll. What's being born in its place will reshape not just the Pacific War, but the entire future of global conflict. The silence in Admiral Soyu Toyoda's office in Tokyo is deafening. It's February 8, 1944, 1 week after the fall of Kwajalein, and Toyoda, newly appointed to replace the deceased Admiral Koga, stares at intelligence reports that read like science fiction. The Americans have captured the heart of the Marshall Island Defense Network in 4 days. 11,000 Japanese troops remain stranded on outer islands that the Americans simply ignored. The entire strategic framework of Japanese Pacific defense has collapsed like a house of cards. How, Toyoda asked his intelligence officer, how did we miss this completely? The answer sits in a manila folder on his desk, the captured Z plan that Philippine guerrillas had fished from a crashed aircraft months earlier. Every Japanese defensive position, every strategic assumption, every tactical doctrine had been laid bare to American intelligence. But even more devastating than this intelligence failure was the deeper psychological blindness it revealed. Japanese military thinking had become trapped in its own cultural assumptions. The belief that honor required meeting enemy strength directly. The conviction that Americans would fight like Japanese, seeking decisive battle where defenses were strongest. The inability to conceive that an enemy might simply walk away from your strengths to strike at your weaknesses. For surviving Japanese commanders like Toyoda, the shock was transformational and permanent. Post-war interrogations reveal officers who describe feeling like they had been fighting ghosts, an enemy that refused to behave predictably, that treated war as an engineering problem rather than a test of spiritual strength. Lieutenant Commander Nabata, one of the few survivors from Kwajalein airfield, later wrote, "We spent months preparing for the wrong war. While we built fortresses, they built flexibility. While we concentrated forces, they concentrated intelligence. While we prepared for battle, they prepared to avoid battle entirely." The psychological impact rippled throughout the Japanese military hierarchy. Field commanders began second-guessing every defensive plan. Was this position too obvious? Would the Americans simply bypass it? How do you defend against an enemy that refuses to attack your defenses? But the Americans weren't finished revolutionizing warfare. What happened in the Marshalls was just the beginning. Over the following months, U.S. forces would leapfrog across the Pacific with devastating efficiency. The Mariana Islands fell in summer 1944, bringing B-29 bombers within range of Japan itself. The Philippines were reconquered through a combination of amphibious assaults and brilliant tactical bypassing of Japanese strongpoints. Each victory validated the new American way of war. Strike where the enemy is weakest, make his strengths irrelevant, win through superior intelligence and operational flexibility rather than superior courage. The human cost of Japanese strategic miscalculation was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers found themselves marooned on bypassed islands, slowly starving while the war moved past them. They had been prepared to die gloriously in battle. Instead, they died slowly and pointlessly, victims of a strategic doctrine that had been rendered obsolete overnight. Today, military strategists study the Marshall Islands campaign as the birth of modern asymmetric warfare. The principles pioneered by American forces in 1944, avoid enemy strengths, exploit intelligence advantages, prioritize operational speed over tactical perfectionism, became the foundation for everything from Cold War proxy conflicts to contemporary counterterrorism operations. But perhaps the most important lesson is psychological rather than tactical.
The Japanese commanders who were so shocked by American island hopping weren't stupid or incompetent. They were trapped by their own cultural assumptions about how wars should be fought, how enemies should behave, how honor and effectiveness should balance against each other. In boardrooms and military academies around the world, the story of Japanese strategic blindness has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumption-based planning. How many businesses have failed by assuming competitors would follow traditional patterns? How many military campaigns have crumbled when enemies refused to fight the expected battle? The storm that claimed Admiral Koga's life on March 31, 1944, was more than just a meteorological accident. It was symbolic of the tempest that American strategic innovation was about to unleash across the Pacific. Japanese commanders had prepared for everything except an enemy that would change the rules of war itself. Standing in the ruins of Kwajalein Atoll, surrounded by the debris of obsolete defensive thinking, Rear Admiral Akiyama had witnessed something that military historians would later recognize as a turning point in human conflict. The age of fortress warfare was ending. The age of maneuver warfare, information warfare, and strategic flexibility had begun. The Americans hadn't just shocked Japanese commanders with their island-hopping strategy. They had shocked the world into a new understanding of what warfare could become when intelligence, innovation, and audacity combined to make the impossible inevitable. Are you prepared for the next strategic revolution? Subscribe now and discover the military innovations that continue to reshape our world, because understanding how the rules changed yesterday might just save your future tomorrow.